Callum McCarthy had 7 brides. Not one of them lasted a week. No bruises, no threats, no violence. They just left before sunrise without a single word. The city called him a monster. The rumors got darker with every woman who walked out that door. But the truth? The truth was locked on the 2nd floor, and it wasn't what anyone expected. Then, a gambling debt brought someone no one saw coming. A woman the world had already written off. She wasn't beautiful. She wasn't powerful. At least, not by society's standards. And when she heard the sound that made every other woman run, she sat down on the floor. And she didn't leave. The real question isn't what Callum McCarthy was hiding. It's why she was the only one who stayed, and why he chose her. 7 brides in 4 years. That was the number people whispered about in the neighborhoods east of the waterfront, in the barbershops and the bakeries, in the back rooms where men played cards and pretended not to fear the name Callum McCarthy. 7 women had walked through the iron gates of his estate on the hill. 7 women had walked out again, some within days, one before sunrise, all of them pale-faced and quiet in a way that made the rumors worse than any truth could be. Nobody talked about why. Not because they didn't know, but because the women themselves refused to say a single word. And that silence, more than anything else, was what made the whole city afraid. The stories changed depending on who told them. Some said Callum was violent, that behind the tailored suits and the controlled voice, there was something monstrous waiting. Others swore he was into things no decent woman could tolerate, rituals or obsessions that belonged in the dark. A few of the older women in the neighborhood crossed themselves when his name came up and said the house itself was cursed, that his mother had died screaming in the parlor and her ghost still walked the 2nd floor. None of it was true, but none of it needed to be, because the truth, the real, quiet, unglamorous truth, was something nobody had ever bothered to look for. Wolfo Callum McCarthy was 36 years old. He had inherited control of the McCarthy family operation at 29 after his father suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak or recognize his own sons. The transition had been brutal and efficient. Callum had consolidated territory, silenced 3 rival factions through a combination of legal leverage and strategic intimidation, and turned the family's construction and real estate holdings into a legitimate empire that now employed over 400 people. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that was handsome in a severe way, sharp jaw, dark eyes set deep beneath heavy brows, a mouth that rarely smiled. He dressed impeccably, he spoke softly, and he had a reputation for patience that terrified people far more than anger ever could, because a patient man is a man who plans, and a man who plans is a man who never loses. But he had lost. 7 times by any public accounting. 7 brides who came and went like weather, each departure confirming what the city already believed, that something was fundamentally broken in Callum McCarthy, something that no amount of money or power or square footage could fix. What nobody knew, what the brides themselves could never bring themselves to explain, was that the problem was not cruelty. It was not violence, or perversion, or ghosts. The problem was a 4-year-old boy named Luca, and the life that revolved around him, like a planet locked in orbit around a star that burned too bright for most people to look at directly. But that part of the story comes later. First, there was the woman. Her name was Thea Calloway, and she was 27 years old, and the first thing most people noticed about her was that she was heavy. Not in the euphemistic way that fashion magazines used the word, not curvy or plus size or any of the careful terms designed to make a body like hers sound like a lifestyle choice. She was overweight in the way that comes from years of eating, to fill something that food cannot fill, from late nights alone with containers of takeout after double shifts, from the particular kind of exhaustion that makes a person stop caring about the mirror because the mirror has never once said anything kind. She carried it in her hips and her stomach and the soft width of her arms, and she had long ago stopped apologizing for it, not because she had arrived at some triumphant place of self-acceptance, but because apologizing was exhausting, and nobody was listening anyway. She had a round face, with good bone structure underneath the fullness, brown skin that her mother had always said was the color of river clay in the afternoon sun, and dark eyes that were startlingly alert. The kind of eyes that noticed when someone's smile didn't reach their expression, when a child was pretending to be fine, when a room had shifted its energy in some subtle, dangerous way. She wore her hair natural, usually pulled back in a low bun, that she secured with whatever was closest, a pencil, a chopstick, once a bread tie that she forgot about for an entire workday. Thea worked as a home health aide. She had been doing it since she was 20, since the semester she dropped out of nursing school, because her brother Nate had gotten arrested for the second time, and the bail money had to come from somewhere. She had a gift for the work, the kind of gift that doesn't show up on a resume. She could read a room the way a musician reads a sheet of music, sensing the dynamics, the tensions, the unspoken needs. She had bathed elderly men without making them feel ashamed. She had held the hands of women with dementia who could not remember their own names, but could still feel loneliness like a knife. She had cleaned wounds and changed sheets, and sat in silence with dying people at 3 a.m, and she had done all of it for $11.75 an hour until 3 months ago, when the agency she worked for had lost its Medicare certification and folded overnight. Since then, she had been surviving on savings that were almost gone, picking up shifts at a laundromat owned by a woman from her church, and trying not to think about the fact that her brother was in trouble again. Nate Calloway was 31 and had been in trouble for most of his adult life, not the dramatic, headline-making kind of trouble, but the slow, grinding kind that wears a family down like water on stone. Gambling, not the organized, high-stakes kind with velvet tables and cocktail waitresses, but the desperate, ugly kind. Online poker at 3 a.m, sports bets, placed with men who charged interest by the week, scratch tickets bought with money that was supposed to cover the electric bill. He had been in and out of programs, had promised to stop more times than Thea could count, and she had believed him every single time because believing him was easier than facing the alternative, which was that her brother might never change and that loving him might never be enough. This time, though, the trouble had a different weight to it. Nate owed money to the wrong people, not a crew or a gang, but something more structured, an operation that ran through the McCarthy family's network of businesses. The amount was $42,000, accumulated over 8 months of escalating bets and compounding interest, and the men who held the debt had recently made it clear that patience was a finite resource. Thea found out on a Tuesday evening in October when Nate showed up at her apartment with a swollen eye and a way of standing that told her at least 2 of his ribs were bruised. He sat at her kitchen table and cried, which he hadn't done in front of her since they were children, and told her everything. She listened. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She made him an ice pack and a cup of tea and sat across from him and felt the familiar weight of being the one who has to figure things out, the one who has to hold the pieces together because nobody else is going to. "There's a way," Nate said, and the way he said it, looking down at the table, his voice small and ashamed, told Thea that whatever came next was going to be something she didn't want to hear. He explained it badly, in fragments and half-sentences, because the full picture was too humiliating to present clearly. The short version was this: Gio Brando, who managed collections for the McCarthy operation, had mentioned, half-joking, Nate insisted, though Thea doubted that his boss was looking for a wife again, that there was a standing arrangement, a kind of trial period, a week at the estate, to see if the match would hold. That the previous women had all been selected through connections and introductions. Beautiful women from families that understood the world Callum moved in. And that every single one of them had left. He said if someone lasted the week, Nate continued, still not looking at her, the debt gets cleared, all of it, gone. And if she doesn't last the week? Nate was quiet for a long time. The debt stays, but the interest stops. Thea sat with that. She sat with the math of it. $42,000 she didn't have, against a week of her life in a house on a hill, with a man the whole city was afraid of. She sat with the indignity of it, the way the arrangement reduced her to a transaction, a body offered up to settle a ledger. She sat with the rage that rose in her chest like a fist directed not at Nate, though he deserved some of it, but at the world that had designed things so that a woman like her, a woman who had spent her entire adult life caring for other people's pain, could end up sitting at a kitchen table calculating whether her dignity was worth $42,000. "They won't pick me," she said flatly. "Look at me." Nate finally looked up. His good eye was wet. "Geo said anyone. He said Callum doesn't care. He said..." He stopped. "What?" "He said it doesn't matter because they all leave anyway." There it was, the brutal honesty of men who have stopped pretending. It doesn't matter who she is, because the outcome is already decided. She'll walk in, she'll see whatever it is that makes women run, and she'll walk out, and the debt will still be there. But at least it won't be growing. Thea thought about her savings account. $412. She thought about her mother, who had died when Thea was 19, and who had made her promise, in the last lucid conversation they ever had, to take care of Nate. She thought about the laundromat, and the church, and the apartment with the radiator that clanged all night. And she thought about the feeling she had carried for her entire life. The feeling of being the person who stays when everyone else leaves, the person who shows up, the person who endures. 1 week, she said, 1 week, and the debt is gone. Gone. She looked at her brother, battered, ashamed, still her brother, still the boy who used to save half his Halloween candy for her because he knew she liked the Reese's cups best. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The car came for her on a Friday afternoon. It was black, immaculate, the kind of car that made the neighbors look out their windows and then quickly look away. Thea had packed a single duffel bag, enough clothes for a week, her phone charger, a book, and a photograph of her mother that she kept in a Ziploc bag to protect it from anything that might happen to the rest of her belongings. The driver was a young man who introduced himself as Paulo, and who was clearly trying not to stare at her in a way that told Thea everything she needed to know about what he'd been expecting. She let him take her bag and sat in the back seat and watched the city change outside the window. The crowded streets of her neighborhood giving way to wider avenues, then to the tree-lined roads that led up into the hills, where the old money lived alongside the new. The McCarthy estate sat behind a wall of gray stone, topped with wrought iron that looked decorative, but wasn't. The gate opened automatically, and the car rolled up a driveway lined with cypress trees that reminded Thea of photographs she'd seen of Tuscany. Places she would never visit, lives she would never live. The house itself was enormous but restrained, stone and dark wood, 3 stories with windows that reflected the late afternoon sky, like blank, watching eyes. Paolo opened her door. The air up here smelled different, cleaner, colder, with a faint undertone of pine and wet earth. Thea stepped out and looked up at the house and felt, for the first time since she'd agreed to this, a tremor of genuine fear. Not of violence, not of the man inside, but of the particular kind of humiliation that comes from being in a place where you so obviously do not belong, where every surface and every silence is designed to remind you of your insufficiency. The front door opened, and a woman in her 60s stepped out. She had silver hair pulled back tight, a face that was all angles and assessment, and the posture of someone who had been running a household for decades and did not suffer foolishness. She looked at Thea for exactly 3 seconds, the duffel bag, the sneakers, the body that didn't match the bodies that had come before, and something moved across her expression that might have been pity and might have been relief. "I'm Marta," she said. "Come inside." The interior of the house was quieter than any building Thea had ever been in. Not the dead quiet of an empty room, but the thick, padded quiet of a place where sound was absorbed by heavy curtains and deep carpets and closed doors. Marta led her through a foyer with a floor of dark marble, past a staircase that curved upward into shadow, and into a hallway that smelled faintly of lemon polish and something else. Something warm and slightly clinical, like the hand sanitizer they used at medical facilities. Thea noticed that. She noticed the small gate at the top of the stairs, the kind used for toddlers, though it was made of polished wood instead of the plastic ones you bought at the hardware store. She noticed the locks on several of the interior doors, not keyed locks but slide bolts positioned high, out of a child's reach. She noticed the soft, thick padding along the base of one hallway wall, subtle enough to look like a design choice but clearly functional. She said nothing. But she filed everything away, because noticing things was what she did, and the things she was noticing were telling a story that didn't match any of the rumors she'd heard. "Your room is on the second floor," Marta said. "Dinner is at 7. Mr. McCarthy will see you then." "Thank you." Marta paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her again with that same unreadable expression. "The others usually asked more questions," she said. "I'm not the others." Something happened in Marta's face then, a softening, barely perceptible, that came and went, like a shadow passing over water. She nodded once and walked away. The room they'd given her was beautiful, in a generic, hotel-like way. Cream walls, white linens, a window overlooking a garden that even in October was meticulously maintained. Thea set her duffel bag on the bed and sat beside it and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. She could hear the house around her, the tick of a clock somewhere down the hall, the distant, muffled sound of a television, and something else, a rhythmic thumping, soft and repetitive, coming from a room above or beside her. Not threatening, not mechanical. It had the quality of something organic, like a person rocking, or a hand hitting a surface in a steady, unconscious pattern. She listened to it for a long time. Then she unpacked her bag, hung her 3 decent outfits in the closet, set her mother's photograph on the nightstand, and went to find the kitchen. She found it before she found anyone else, a massive room with professional-grade appliances, and a granite island large enough to seat 8. Marta was there, preparing something in a large pot, and she didn't look surprised to see Thea. Dinner's not until 7, Marta said. "I know. Can I help?" Another pause, another assessment. "You cook?" "I cook." Marta handed her a cutting board and a pile of vegetables without another word, and for the next hour they worked side by side in a silence that was not unfriendly. Thea julienned carrots and diced onions and minced garlic with the efficient, unhurried motions of someone who had spent a lot of time feeding people, and Marta watched her hands with an expression that gradually shifted from skepticism to something approaching approval. It was during this hour that Thea heard it again, the thumping, closer now, directly above the kitchen. And then, cutting through the quiet like a blade, a sound that made Thea's hands go still on the cutting board, a high, wordless cry, not of pain but of frustration. The kind of sound that comes from a throat that has never learned to shape its distress into language. Marta's face didn't change, her hands didn't stop moving, but there was a tension in her shoulders that told Thea everything. This was it. This was the thing. Whatever lived above the kitchen, whoever made that sound, was the reason 7 women had walked out the front door and never come back. "The carrots are fine," Marta said. "They don't need to be perfect." Thea realized she had stopped cutting. She resumed, and the sound above them stopped, replaced by the murmur of a voice, low, male, speaking words. Thea couldn't make out, but could feel the shape of, soothing, patient, repeating. She didn't ask, not yet. Because in her years of home health care, she had learned that the most important information is always volunteered, never extracted, and that the fastest way to make someone close down is to ask the question they're most afraid of answering. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 20 but was set for 2. Thea was seated at one end of a table that stretched between them like a field of polished mahogany, and Callum McCarthy entered from a door at the far end at exactly 7 o'clock. He was bigger than she'd expected, Not just tall, broad with the build of a man who had done physical labor in his youth and maintained the frame through discipline rather than vanity. His suit was charcoal, well-fitted, and his dark hair was pushed back from a forehead that showed the first faint lines of a man who carried more than most people knew. His eyes found her immediately, and in them, Thea saw something she recognized fear from 1,000 encounters in her work, the look of someone bracing for disappointment. Not giving it. Expecting it. He sat down. He unfolded his napkin. He did not say, "Welcome" or "Thank you for coming," or any of the things a normal person might say to a woman who had just agreed to live in his house for a week. What he said was, "You should know that I don't expect you to stay." His voice was low, even, stripped of inflection. Not rude. Worse than rude. Resigned. "I heard," Thea said. "Then you know the arrangement. 1 week. You're free to leave at any time, day or night. Paula will drive you." "I heard that too." He looked at her then, really looked, not at her body, or her clothes, or the surface things that other people catalogued first, but at her face, at her eyes, as if he were searching for something he was fairly certain he wouldn't find. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked. "My brother owes you money." "Your brother owes Gio money. There's a difference." "Not from where I'm sitting." The faintest flicker in his expression, not a smile, the shadow of where a smile might live if it were ever allowed out. "Marta says you cook," he said. "Marta says a lot in very few words." Now there was something, a micro-expression, gone before she could name it, that suggested Callum McCarthy was not entirely prepared for her. The brides before had been nervous, or seductive, or performatively brave. They had tried to impress him, or soothe him, or challenge him. None of them had ever just been present, speaking in a normal voice, treating the situation with the matter-of-fact clarity of a woman who had sat in far more uncomfortable rooms than this one. Dinner was good, roasted chicken with root vegetables, bread that Marta had clearly made from scratch. They ate in chauffoir, near silence, punctuated by the clink of silverware and the soft sound of wind against the dining room windows. Callum ate carefully, precisely, the way he seemed to do everything, and Thea ate with the honest appetite of someone who had no interest in performing daintiness. Halfway through the meal, the sound came again, the cry, wordless, climbing in pitch, then breaking off sharply. Oh, this time it was closer, filtering down through the ceiling directly above the dining room. Callum's fork stopped, his jaw tightened, and for the first time, Thea saw something in his face that the rest of the city would never have believed. Raw, exposed vulnerability, there and gone in a flash, like a wound glimpsed beneath a bandage. He set down his fork. "Excuse me," he said, and left the room. Thea sat alone in the dining room for 20 minutes. She could hear footsteps above her, heavy, then light. The cry came again, followed by the same low, murmuring voice. Then a different sound, a series of high, sharp claps, rhythmic, insistent. Then silence. Callum returned. He sat down. He picked up his fork. He did not explain. "The chicken is good," Thea said. He looked at her as if she had said something extraordinary. "It is," he agreed. And they finished the meal. That night, lying in the guest bed with the photograph of her mother propped against the lamp, Thea stared at the ceiling and listened to the house. It was different at night. The sounds were more exposed, less masked by the daytime rhythms of cooking and movement. She could hear that thumping again, sometimes stopping for long stretches and then resuming with a different tempo. She could hear the low voice, always the low voice, and she realized with a certainty that settled into her chest like a stone that it was Callum's voice, and that he was up there every night, and that whatever he was doing it alone. She thought about the 7 women. She thought about what kind of thing would make a woman leave a man who was wealthy and powerful, and from what she'd seen so far, not cruel, not violent, not any of the things the rumors claimed. She thought about the padded walls, and the child gate, and the locks on the doors, and the high, wordless cry, and she understood. She understood. And she didn't leave. In the morning, Thea was up at 6. Habit. Years of early shifts had rewired her internal clock beyond repair. She dressed in jeans and a loose sweater and went downstairs to find the kitchen empty, the coffee maker cold, and the house still wrapped in the thick silence of a place where mornings were something to be survived rather than welcomed. She made coffee. She found eggs and bread and butter and made breakfast with the quiet competence of someone who finds comfort in feeding people. She was plating the eggs when Marta appeared in the doorway, stopped, and stared at her with an expression that Thea would later learn to recognize as Marta's version of being moved. "You're still here," Marta said. "It's only been one night. The last one left at midnight. The one before that made it to dawn." Thea set a plate on the counter. "Sit down, eat." Marta sat down and ate, and something shifted between them. Not friendship, not yet, but the beginning of an understanding between two women who were both, in their different ways, keeping this house alive. "His name is Luca," Marta said without looking up from her plate. Thea waited. "He's 4. He's Mr. McCarthy's son." Still waiting. "He has—" Marta paused, searching for the word, or perhaps searching for the courage to say it to someone new, someone who would hear it and judge and leave like all the rest. "He doesn't speak. He sees the world differently. The doctors use words I can never remember. Autism spectrum, they say. Severe. He doesn't talk, doesn't make eye contact, doesn't like to be touched. He has episodes, meltdowns, they call them. He screams. He hits his head on. And to things, he rocks for hours." She said all of this in the same flat, practical tone she used to talk about dinner menus and cleaning schedules. But her hands were gripping the edges of her plate with a force that whitened her knuckles. His mother left when he was diagnosed. Before that, even, she left when she saw the signs and the first doctor confirmed what she already suspected. She signed away her rights. "Mr. McCarthy has raised him alone." "Well, not alone, with me. And Renata. She's the therapist. And Paulo drives them to appointments. But at night, when Luca doesn't sleep, when he's screaming and there's nothing to do but sit with him and wait for it to pass, that's Mr. McCarthy, alone, every night." Marta finally looked up, and her eyes were fierce in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with loyalty. "The brides," she said. "They come in expecting a man, a powerful man, with a big house and money and a life they can step into like a magazine. And then they hear Luca, and they see him, rocking, not looking at them, screaming if someone touches him wrong, and their faces—" She stopped, swallowed. "Their faces change. You can see it happen the moment they realize that this isn't a house with a secret. It's a house with a child, and the child isn't going anywhere, and the man isn't going to choose between them." "He shouldn't have to," Thea said. Marta looked at her for a long time. Then she picked up her fork and ate another bite of egg and said very quietly, "No, he shouldn't." Thea spent the morning exploring the parts of the house that weren't locked. It was larger than it looked from outside. Rooms opening into rooms, hallways leading to unexpected wings. She found a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a leather armchair worn soft by use. She found a sunroom with glass walls overlooking the garden. She found a room that had been converted into a gym with weights and a heavy bag that showed the marks of regular use. And she found the hallway on the second floor where the padded walls were thickest, where the door at the end was closed, and the slide bolt was drawn, and where a small strip of light leaked from underneath, along with the barely audible sound of something spinning, a top or a wheel or a fan, and the gentle, repetitive murmur of a voice reading aloud. She stood in that hallway for a full minute. Then she went back downstairs. She didn't see Callum until the afternoon. He appeared in the kitchen doorway at 2 o'clock, wearing a shirt with the sleeves rolled up and an expression that was harder to read than anything Thea had encountered in her professional life. He looked at her, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee and a book, and she could see him performing the calculation. Still here, day 2, hasn't asked about the sounds, hasn't packed her bag, hasn't cried, or demanded an explanation, or looked at him with the particular blend of horror and pity that he had seen in 7 other faces. "You met Marta this morning," he said. I meet Marta every morning. I was here yesterday, too. She told you. It wasn't a question, but Thea answered it anyway. She told me about Luca, yes. His face did something complicated then, a sequence of micro-expressions that moved through surprise, anger, resignation, and something that looked like the most exhausted form of hope. The kind of hope that has been beaten down so many times it can barely lift its head. And, he said. And what? And now you know, so. He was waiting for her to leave. He was standing in his own kitchen, in his own house, with his shoulders braced and his jaw tight, waiting for a woman he'd known for less than 24 hours to confirm what every other woman had confirmed, that his son was too much. That the life he'd built around Luca's needs was too strange, too demanding, too far from what any reasonable person would accept. I'd like to meet him, Thea said. Callum blinked. In 4 years of introducing brides to the reality of his life, no one had ever said those words in that order with that tone, simple, direct, without a trace of reluctance. He doesn't, Callum started and then stopped, because the rest of the sentence was a catalogue of warnings he had given so many times that it had become a kind of armor. He doesn't talk, he doesn't make eye contact, he doesn't like strangers, he might scream, he might hit himself, he might not acknowledge you exist. I know, Thea said. Marta told me. I'd still like to meet him. She watched Callum struggle with something she recognized from her work, with families in crisis, the simultaneous desire to protect and to hope, the fear that letting someone in will only make the inevitable rejection worse. She had seen it in parents who had been told their child would never walk, never speak, never live independently. She had seen the way they held their children tighter and pushed the world away, building walls so high that sometimes even the light couldn't get in. Not today, Callum said. He had a difficult night. Okay. Maybe tomorrow. Okay. He stood there for another moment, looking at her as if she were a sentence in a language he almost, but not quite understood. And then he turned and left, and Thea went back to her book. The second night was worse than the first. Luca's cries began around 11 and continued, with breaks, until almost 3 in the morning. Thea lay in bed and listened, and did not cover her ears, and did not put a pillow over her head. She listened the way she had listened to dying patients, who cried out in the night, not with fear, not with pity, but with the full, unflinching attention of someone who understands that pain deserves to be witnessed, even when there is nothing to be done about it. At some point, she heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy, Callum's, and the sound of a door opening and a voice so gentle it was almost unrecognizable from the controlled, flat tone he used with adults. The cries continued, then shifted, then gradually softened into the repetitive thumping that Thea was beginning to understand was Luca's version of self-soothing, a rhythm he could control when everything else felt uncontrollable. She fell asleep around 3:30. When she woke at 6, she went downstairs and made coffee and eggs and toast, and when Callum appeared in the kitchen at 7 with shadows under his eyes deep enough to hold water, she set a plate in front of him without a word. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. "You heard," he said. "Yes." "And you're making me breakfast. You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday." "I haven't." "Then eat." He ate, and somewhere in the middle of that meal, in the quiet kitchen with the morning light coming through the windows and the smell of coffee filling the space between them, something changed, not dramatically, not with a declaration or a revelation or a turning point that announced itself. It changed the way dawn changes, gradually, imperceptibly, with a quality of inevitability that can only be recognized after it has already happened. Callum McCarthy had spent 4 years waiting for someone to sit across from him in the morning after a bad night and not ask him to explain, not offer advice, not look at him with the terrible compassion of someone who was already planning their exit. And Thea Calloway, who had spent her entire adult life being the person who stays, who shows up, who endures, set a plate of eggs in front of a man she barely knew and didn't ask a single question. And in that silence, Both of them heard something they had been straining to hear for longer than they could remember. The possibility that they were not alone. On the third day, Callum took her to meet Luca. He did it with the stiffness of a man performing an act he has performed before and which has always ended badly. He led her up the stairs to the second floor, past the guest rooms and the locked doors, to the end of the padded hallway where the door with the slide bolt stood. He paused with his hand on the bolt and looked at her, and in his eyes Thea saw the desperate, contradictory prayer of every parent who has ever loved a child the world isn't built for. Please see him, and please don't hurt him, and please, this time, don't leave. He didn't say any of that. He said, he might not look at you. That's okay. He might scream. That's okay. He's not. Callum's voice caught just slightly on a jagged edge that he usually kept buried. He's not what people expect. Thea looked at him. Neither am I. He slid the bolt and opened the door. The room was not what Thea expected. She had imagined something institutional, white walls, medical equipment, the sterile functionality of a care facility. Instead, the room was warm and carefully designed, with soft lighting that could be adjusted, walls painted a deep, calming blue, and a floor covered in thick, interlocking foam tiles. One wall was lined with shelves containing identical small objects, arranged in precise rows, wooden blocks, all the same size and color, positioned with the kind of exactness that spoke of a mind that found comfort in order. A weighted blanket lay folded on a low platform bed. A sensory swing hung from a reinforced hook in the ceiling. In the corner, a small table held a collection of spinning tops in various sizes, and beside the table, sitting on the floor with his legs crossed and his back to the door, was Luca. He was small for 4. He had Callum's dark hair, cut short, and his mother's lighter skin, and he was rocking gently, his upper body moving forward and back in a rhythm that was as steady and precise as a metronome. In his hands he held a wooden block, and he was turning it, not examining it, not playing with it, but rotating it with a fixed, absorbed intensity that excluded everything else in the room. He did not turn around when the door opened. He did not react to his father's presence or to the presence of a stranger. He continued to rock and turn the block, and the sound of his movement, the soft shift of fabric against the foam floor, the tiny click of the block rotating in his fingers, filled the room like a heartbeat. Thea stood in the doorway and looked at him, and what she felt was not pity. It was not horror, or discomfort, or the reflexive recoil that she knew other women had felt in this exact spot. What she felt was recognition, the deep, bone-level recognition of one person seeing another person clearly and understanding, without analysis or explanation, that they were looking at someone who experienced the world with an intensity that most people could not fathom, and that this intensity was not a deficit, it was a difference. She did not approach him. She did not speak. She lowered herself to the floor, slowly and carefully, and sat down near the door, not close to Luca, but in his space, sharing the air, existing in the same room without demanding anything. Callum stood behind her, barely breathing. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Luca rocked and turned his block. Thea sat still, her hands resting on her knees, her breathing slow and even. She had learned this in her work with elderly patients who had dementia and would become agitated by sudden movements or unfamiliar voices. The art of being present without being intrusive, of occupying space without filling it with expectation. At the 12-minute mark, Luca's rocking slowed. It didn't stop, but the amplitude decreased, smaller movements, less urgent. His head tilted just slightly, not turning toward her, but angling in a way that suggested some part of his awareness had registered the new presence. Thea noticed. She said nothing. At the 15-minute mark, Luca set down his block. He picked up another one, identical as far as Thea could tell, and began rotating it in the same pattern. But the rhythm was different. Slightly slower, slightly less absorbed. And then, without looking at her, without any change in his posture or expression, Luca picked up a third block and pushed it. Not threw it, not dropped it, but placed it deliberately in Thea's direction. It slid across the foam floor and came to rest about 2 feet from her knee. Behind her, Callum made a sound. A small sound caught in his throat, barely audible, because in 4 years of bringing women into this room, Luca had never once acknowledged their existence. Not with eye contact, not with movement, not with any gesture that could be interpreted as awareness. He had continued his routines as if they were furniture, as if they were air, and the women had stood there feeling invisible and disturbed, and had left the room with faces that told Callum everything he needed to know about their answer. But Luca had pushed a block toward Thea. She looked at it. She looked at the block in his hands, the way his fingers moved on it, the rotation pattern, the angle, and then, very carefully, she picked up the block he had given her and began to turn it. Not the way she would naturally hold an object, but the way he was holding his, mimicking the rotation, matching the rhythm, entering his world instead of asking him to enter hers. They sat like that for nearly 30 minutes. A woman and a boy, turning wooden blocks in the same pattern, sharing a rhythm that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with understanding. When Thea finally stood up and walked out of the room, Callum was leaning against the hallway wall, with his hand over his mouth and his eyes closed, and he was trembling. She pretended not to see. She walked past him and went downstairs and started making lunch, and when he appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "He's never done that before," Callum said. "I know. How did you know what to do?" Thea thought about that. She thought about the years of sitting with people who couldn't communicate in conventional ways. The hours spent learning to read bodies instead of words. The particular kind of patience that comes from loving someone who cannot love you back in the language you speak. "I didn't do anything," she said. "I just sat there." "That's not nothing. That's—" He stopped. She could see him fighting something, struggling against a lifetime of control and containment, and she gave him the space to lose that fight at his own pace. "The other women," he said very quietly. They would stand at the door. Some of them tried to talk to him, to use that voice people use, high-pitched, exaggerated, the way you talk to a baby. It made him worse. Some of them just stared. One of them cried. One said, "Is this a joke?" And one, his jaw worked. One said, "Can't you send him somewhere?" The words hung in the kitchen like smoke. "I broke a glass." After that one, Callum said. "First time I'd lost my temper in years." Marta had to replace the whole shelf. "Good," Thea said. He looked at her. "She deserved a broken glass," Thea said. "At minimum." And then, for the first time in her presence, for the first time in what might have been months or years, Callum McCarthy almost smiled. Not fully, not freely. But the muscles around his eyes shifted, and the line of his mouth softened, and for a moment, he looked like a man instead of a fortress. The 4th day, the 5th, the 6th. Time moved differently in the house on the hill, measured not in hours but in small, accumulating moments that built on each other like layers of sediment forming stone. Thea visited Luca every day. She learned his rhythms, the times when he was most alert, the triggers that could set off a meltdown, the objects and textures that soothed him. She learned that he liked the color blue, that he was fascinated by spinning things, that he had a particular sensitivity to high-pitched sounds that could send him into a screaming episode that lasted hours. She learned that he ate only 4 foods: plain rice, specific crackers, sliced apples, and a particular brand of yogurt, and that any deviation from this list, any substitution or change in presentation, was perceived by his nervous system as a threat. She didn't try to change any of this. She didn't arrive with strategies or suggestions or the well-meaning advice of someone who had read an article and thought they understood. She observed. She adapted. She entered Luca's world on his terms and stayed there. On the 4th day, she sat with him for an hour, and he pushed 2 blocks toward her. On the 5th day, he pushed 3, and when she rotated them in his pattern, he made a sound. A short, soft vocalization, not a word, but an acknowledgement, a note of something that Thea's trained ear recognized as satisfaction. On the sixth day, she was sitting on the floor, rotating her block when Lucas stood up, walked over to her, and placed a block directly in her lap. Then he returned to his spot and resumed rocking. The whole interaction lasted 4 seconds, but the distance he had crossed, physically and psychologically, was enormous. Each time Thea left the room and went downstairs, Callum was there, not always in the kitchen, not always visible, but present in the house in a way that told her he was tracking her movements, listening for the sounds that would tell him whether his son was calm or escalating, waiting for the moment when she would come down the stairs with a different expression, the expression that meant she was done, that she had reached her limit, that she was ready to go. That moment didn't come. Instead, other moments came. Small ones. Thea found a book on the library shelf about sensory processing in children, and read it in an afternoon. She asked Marta about Luca's therapy schedule and listened with the focused attention of a professional, asking specific, practical questions that Marta hadn't been asked in years. She noticed that the weighted blanket on Luca's bed was wearing thin and mentioned it to Callum, who looked at her as if she had spoken a language he didn't know he'd been yearning to hear. On the 5th night, she heard Luca's cries begin at midnight and lay in bed for 10 minutes, listening. Then she got up, put on her robe, and padded down the hallway to the closed door at the end. She could hear Callum's voice inside, raw, exhausted, a man running on fumes and willpower. She knocked softly. The voice stopped. Footsteps, the bolt sliding back. Callum opened the door and looked at her, and he was a wreck, shirt untucked, hair disheveled, dark circles carved into his face like trenches. Behind him, Luca was sitting on the bed, rocking violently, hitting the side of his head with an open palm in a repetitive motion that was clearly distressing to both father and child. "Let me," Thea said. "You don't have to, I know, let me." He stepped aside. Not because he trusted her. He didn't trust anyone with Luca, not fully, not yet. But because he was so tired that his body made the decision his mind couldn't, and his body said, "Let her." Thea walked into the room and sat on the floor near the bed. Not close enough to crowd Luca, but close enough that her presence was tangible. She didn't speak. She didn't try to stop the self-hitting. She knew, from her training, from her experience, from the deep well of intuition that was her truest skill, that what Luca needed right now was not intervention, but regulation. His nervous system was overwhelmed, flooded with input it couldn't process, and the hitting was his attempt to override the chaos with a sensation he could control. She began to hum, low, steady, the melody barely there, not a lullaby, not a song, just a vibration, a constant in the storm. She matched it to the rhythm of his rocking, sinking herself to his frequency instead of trying to impose her own. Callum stood in the doorway and watched. It took 20 minutes. The hitting slowed. The rocking decreased in amplitude. Luca's breathing, which had been ragged and sharp, began to even out. He didn't look at Thea. He didn't stop rocking. But the violence drained out of his movements, and the hitting changed to a gentle tapping, knuckles against the mattress instead of palm against skull, and the high-pitched keening that had filled the room descended into a low, almost inaudible drone. Thea kept humming, and eventually, with the gradual surrender of a body that has finally exhausted its capacity for distress, Luca lay down on his side, pulled the weighted blanket over himself, and went still. Not asleep. Still. Which, for Luca, was almost the same thing. Thea sat on the floor for another 10 minutes, humming softly, making sure the calm had settled. Then she stood up, carefully, and walked out of the room. Callum was in the hallway. He had slid down the wall and was sitting on the floor with his forearms resting on his raised knees, his head bowed. Thea sat down beside him. Not close enough to touch. Close enough to be there. They sat in the hallway for a long time, saying nothing, while the house breathed around them and Luca's room was silent for the first time in hours. "I've had specialists," Callum said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Therapists, sleep consultants, a woman who charges $800 an hour and flies in from Boston. None of them have gotten him calm that fast." "They're trying to fix him," Thea said. "I'm not." Callum lifted his head and looked at her. In the dim light of the hallway, with the shadows pooling under his eyes, and the lines of his face softened by exhaustion, he looked younger than 36. He looked like a man who had been carrying something so heavy that his bones had begun to reshape themselves around its weight. "Why?" he said. "Why what? Why are you here? Why are you doing this? The debt, it's a week's obligation. You could have sat in the guest room and read your book and left on Friday and called it done. Why are you—" He gestured toward Luca's door. "Why do you care?" Thea considered the question. She considered giving him a simple answer. "Because it's the right thing. Because I'm a caregiver. Because your son is a child and children deserve compassion." All of those were true. None of them were the whole truth. "When I was 12, she said, my mother got sick, cancer. It took 2 years. And during those 2 years, people visited. At first, friends, neighbors, church people. They brought casseroles and said they were praying and asked how my mother was doing, and then they went home and lived their lives. And one by one, they stopped coming. Not because they were bad people, because it was too much. Because watching someone suffer when you can't fix it is the hardest thing in the world. And most people would rather look away." She paused. The hallway was so quiet she could hear the clock downstairs. "My mother noticed who stayed. She kept a list, not on paper, in her head. The people who came even when it was ugly. Even when she was vomiting and couldn't keep her eyes open and didn't look like herself anymore. Even when there was nothing to do but sit there and be present. She told me once that those people, the ones who stayed, they were the only ones who actually loved her. Because love isn't what you feel when things are good. Love is what you do when things are unbearable, and you stay anyway." She looked at Callum. "That's why I'm here. Because I've spent my whole life being the one who stays. And your son doesn't need someone who's going to leave." Callum didn't respond. He sat very still, and in the silence, Thea heard the thing that she had been listening for since she arrived. Not a sound, but an absence. The absence of the wall. The faintest, most imperceptible. Given the fortress that Callum McCarthy had built around himself and his son, a crack just wide enough for light to enter. The 7th day, the last day of the arrangement, arrived with a kind of weight that settled over the house like weather. Marta was quieter than usual. Paulo lingered in the driveway longer than necessary. Even the house itself seemed to be holding its breath. Thea woke at 6 and went to the kitchen and made coffee and did not pack her bag. Callum appeared at 7:30. He was dressed formally. Dark suit, tie, the armor of a man preparing for a business day. But his eyes went immediately to the counter where her coffee cup sat, and then to the stove where a pot of oatmeal was simmering, and then to her face. "Today's the last day," he said. "I know. Paulo can drive you whenever you're ready. The debt is cleared. I called Gio this morning." "I know." He waited. She could feel him waiting, the same way she had felt patients' families wait for test results, holding themselves together with the disciplined stillness of people who have learned that falling apart is a luxury they cannot afford. "I'd like to stay," Thea said. The kitchen went very quiet. "You don't have to," Callum said, and his voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a man who is managing his expectations, because the alternative is hope, and hope is the most dangerous thing he knows. "I know I don't have to. I'd like to. The debt is cleared. You have no obligation. This isn't about the debt. It hasn't been about the debt since the 2nd day." She turned to face him fully, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let him see what she had been carefully keeping. Behind a professional calm, the full force of her feeling. The tender, fierce, unglamorous love of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated and who had found, in a padded room on the 2nd floor of a Mafia boss's mansion, the thing she had been looking for without knowing. She was looking for it. Luca needs consistency, she said. He needs someone who shows up at the same time every day and sits on the same spot on the floor and turns the blocks in the same pattern and doesn't leave. That's not something you hire. That's not something a therapist from Boston does for $800 an hour. That's something a person does because they've decided to be there, not for a week, not for a trial period, but for real. Callum's hands, hanging at his sides, clenched into fists, not in anger, but in the physical effort of containing something that was trying to break free. And what about me? He said, and the question was so quiet, so stripped of the authority and control that defined his public self, that Thea understood she was hearing something that perhaps no one in his adult life had ever heard. Callum McCarthy asking if he mattered. You need the same thing, she said. You need someone who stays. The moment stretched between them, thin and luminous, and in it, Thea saw everything. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the years of nights spent on the floor of his son's room, the parade of women who had looked at his life and found it wanting, the slow, corrosive erosion of a man who had begun to believe that he and Luca were an island, permanently separated from the mainland of ordinary human connection. Callum opened his mouth to say something, and then his phone rang. The call changed the texture of the day. Thea watched it happen, the way Callum's face shifted from open to closed, in the time it took to glance at the screen, the way his posture changed, his shoulders squaring, his jaw setting. The man replacing the father in a transition, so practiced it was almost invisible. He answered, listened, said 4 words. Where? How many? When? And hung up. I have to go, he said. What happened? He looked at her, and she could see the calculation happening. How much to tell her, how much to trust her, how much of his world to let her see. My brother-in-law, he said. Vincent Ferraro. He married my sister before she died. He's been contesting custody of Luca. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Custody, Thea repeated. Vincent believes Luca should be in institutional care. He's been building a case, documenting Luca's episodes, collecting statements from staff, arguing that the home environment is insufficient. He filed a motion last month. Can he do that? He can do whatever he can pay a lawyer to file. And he can pay a lot. Callum's expression was the one she had seen on the faces of parents in crisis, the cold, focused intensity of a person who is calculating threats and responses with the precision of a general planning a defense. He's arranged a home inspection. Today, a social worker and a child welfare advocate will be here at 2 o'clock if they determine that Luca's care is inadequate. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Vincent doesn't want Luca, Callum said. And now there was something in his voice that Thea hadn't heard before, a raw, barely contained fury that burned beneath the surface like fire under ice. He wants leverage. He wants the McCarthy name and the assets that come with it. Luca is a chess piece to him. If he gets custody, he puts Luca in a facility and uses the guardianship to access the family trust. He's done the math. He knows exactly what Luca is worth to him in dollars. Thea's stomach turned. Not with fear, with anger. The deep, righteous anger of a person who has spent her life caring for vulnerable people and who recognizes, with the precision of a surgeon identifying a malignancy, the exact shape of a cruelty disguised as concern. What do you need? She said. Callum looked at her. I need the house to look right. I need Luca to be calm. He stopped. I need them to see that he's cared for. That this is a home, not a facility. That he has a family. We said. The word hung in the air between them. Yes, Callum said. The next 4 hours were the most focused of Thea's life. She moved through the house with a purpose that surprised even Marta, who had seen a lot of determined women in her time, but none quite like this. Thea cleaned. She cooked, she rearranged, she took the medical supplies that were stored in a visible cabinet in the hallway and reorganized them into labeled containers in a closet. She moved Luca's therapy schedule from a clinical spreadsheet, pinned to the kitchen wall, to a colorful calendar she handmade from supplies she found in a desk drawer. She placed children's books, which she found in boxes in a storage room, still wrapped in plastic, bought with hope and never opened, on low shelves in the living room and in Luca's room. She worked with the quick, instinctive intelligence of someone who understood what inspectors look for, because she had been on the other side of enough home visits to know that what matters is not perfection, but warmth. A home is not judged by its cleanliness, but by its life. The evidence that people live there, that a child is not just housed but nurtured, that the rhythms of the household revolve around care rather than containment. At noon, she went to Luca's room. He was sitting in his usual spot, rotating a block. She sat on the floor in her usual spot and picked up her block. They turned their blocks together for 10 minutes, synchronized, silent, two people sharing a language that had no words. Then, Thea did something she had never done before. She placed her block on the floor in front of Luca, not pushing it toward him, but setting it down gently in the space between them and leaving it there. Luca's rocking paused. He looked at the block, not at Thea. He didn't look at her face, didn't make eye contact, but at the block she had placed, studying its position, its orientation, its relationship to his own blocks. And then, with a delicacy that made Thea's throat tight, Luca placed his block next to hers, touching, aligned, 2 blocks side by side, in the space between them. Thea's eyes burned. She blinked hard and swallowed and placed another block beside his. He placed another beside hers, and slowly, over the course of 5 silent minutes, they built a row, not a tower, not a structure, nothing that would look impressive or meaningful to an outside observer, just a line, a simple, straight line of blocks stretching across the floor, between a 27-year-old woman and a 4-year-old boy, connecting them. When Thea came downstairs, her eyes were red and her voice was steady. He's ready," she told Callum. "He'll be okay." Callum looked at her face and saw the red eyes and didn't ask, because he understood, better than anyone in the world, that some things that happen in that room are too sacred to describe. The inspectors arrived at 2 o'clock. There were 2 of them, a social worker named Dr. Patricia Feldman, who had the brisk, impersonal manner of someone who conducted dozens of these visits a month, and a child welfare advocate named Iris Chen, who was younger and whose eyes were kinder. With them, standing slightly apart with the unmistakable posture of a man who was there to observe and not to help, was Vincent Ferraro. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, with the tanned, manicured look of a man who spent more time on golf courses than in offices. He looked at the house the way a real estate agent looks at a property, assessing value, cataloging deficiencies, searching for leverage. He looked at Thea, standing in the foyer beside Callum, and his expression barely flickered. She was not what he expected, not beautiful, not polished, not the kind of woman whose presence would bolster Callum's image. She could see him calculating, deciding she was irrelevant, filing her away. That was his mistake. The inspection was thorough. Dr. Feldman moved through the house with a clipboard, noting conditions, asking questions about routines, diet, medical care, emergency protocols. Iris Chen focused on the physical environment, safety features, accessible spaces, sensory accommodations. Callum answered every question with the controlled precision of a man who had prepared for this his entire life, producing documentation and records with the efficiency of someone who understood that bureaucracy was a battlefield and paper was ammunition. And then they went upstairs to see Luca. Thea walked in first, not because anyone asked her to, and not because she was performing for the inspectors, but because she knew, with the certainty that comes from spending 6 days in learning a child's rhythms, that Luca needed a familiar presence before strangers entered his space. She sat on the floor. She picked up a block. She began to turn it. Luca was rocking. His amplitude was higher than usual. He could feel the change in the house, the new voices, the disruption of routine. His breathing was faster. One hand was pressed flat against the wall, pushing rhythmically, his body seeking the deep pressure that calmed his nervous system. Thea hummed, low, steady, the same non-melody she had used on the night she'd calmed him. She matched her rhythm to his rocking, and within 2 minutes, his amplitude decreased. Within 5, he was calm enough to pick up a block and begin his rotation. Dr. Feldman and Iris Chen entered the room and stood by the door, watching. Vincent Ferraro stood behind them, his face carefully neutral. Luca did not melt down. He did not scream. He continued his routine, rocking, rotating, existing in his own space with the particular dignity of a child who has not been taught to perform for adults. And then, in a moment that no one in the room except Thea and Callum could fully appreciate, Luca picked up a block and pushed it toward Thea. She picked it up and placed it beside her own. He pushed another. She placed it. The line grew between them. Their line, their ritual, their shared language, and the room filled with a silence so complete and so gentle that even Dr. Feldman's pen stopped moving. Iris Chen knelt down, slowly, and watched. Her eyes moved between the boy and the woman, tracking the interaction, reading the dynamic with a professional eye that saw what the blocks represented. See just not a trick, not a performance, but a relationship. A real, living connection between a child who could not speak and a woman who had learned to listen without words. "How long has she been working with him?" Iris asked Callum, who was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his heart in his throat. 6 days, he said. Iris looked at him. 6 days. She's not a therapist. She's not a specialist. He faltered because the word that wanted to come out was one he hadn't earned the right to say. Not yet. Not this soon. And Callum McCarthy was a man who did not use words he hadn't earned. "She's, family," Marta said from behind him. Nobody had noticed her arrive. She stood in the hallway with her arms folded and her chin raised, and the fierce, unwavering expression of a woman who would burn the house down before she let anyone take the child she had helped raise. "She's family," Marta repeated. "And she's staying." The inspection lasted another hour. Dr. Feldman asked additional questions about Luca's therapeutic interventions, his developmental trajectory, his daily schedule. Thea answered some of them, the practical ones, the ones about routine and diet and sleep patterns, with a specificity that revealed not just 6 days of observation, but a lifetime of professional intuition about caring for people whose needs the world doesn't always understand. Vincent Ferraro said very little during the inspection, but when they were leaving, walking down the driveway toward the car, he paused beside Thea and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You know this isn't real. Whatever arrangement he's made with you, it won't hold up." Thea looked at him. She looked at his manicured hands and his expensive shoes and the smooth, well-fed face of a man who had never sat on a floor and turned a wooden block for 30 minutes because a child needed him to. "Oh, you're right that I'm an arrangement," she said. "But the way I take care of that boy is the realest thing in this house. And if you try to take him away from his father, you're going to find out exactly how real I am." Vincent's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a recalibration, the look of a man who has underestimated an opponent and is only now beginning to realize the scope of his error. He got in the car. The car left. The gate closed. Callum found Thea in the kitchen. She was sitting at the counter with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she was shaking, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the fine internal tremor of a person whose adrenaline has crested and is now receding, leaving behind the full weight of what just happened. He sat down across from her. For a long time, he said nothing. The kitchen clock ticked. The house settled around them. "You called yourself an arrangement," he said. "It's what I am." "Is it?" She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't name, something beyond gratitude, beyond attraction, beyond the standard vocabulary of what men feel when women do extraordinary things. It was the look of a man who was seeing something he thought was impossible. Someone who has entered the most damaged, most protected part of his life and hasn't flinched. "I don't know what I am to you," Thea said honestly. "I know what I am to Luca. I know what I am to Marta. I know what I am to this house. But you and we've known each other for a week. 6 days. 6 days. It took me 4 years to find someone who would sit on the floor with my son. It took Luca 4 years to push a block toward another person. 6 days might not be long enough for some things, but it's long enough for me to know that whatever this is, I don't want it to end on a Friday because a schedule says it should." Thea's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "I'm not what you need," she said, and the words came out before she could stop them, shaped by years of being told, by mirrors, by men, by the quiet arithmetic of a world that measures women's value in dress sizes, that she was not enough. "What I need," Callum said, "is someone who stays. You said that yourself. I meant for Luca. I know what you meant. I'm telling you what I mean." The air between them felt charged and fragile, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks, when everything is still and heavy and full of potential. "This isn't a fairy tale," Thea said. "I'm not going to pretend that I walked into your house and fell in love in a week. That's not how this works, not for me. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for time. Time. Stay, not as an arrangement, not as a trial. Stay because Luca needs you, and because He stopped, restarted. "Because I would like the chance to know you, in real time, without a deadline." Thea studied his face. The exhaustion that was always there, the control that never fully slipped, and underneath it all, the cautious, battered hope of a man who had stopped believing that anyone would choose this life, this house, this child, this version of happiness that didn't look like any magazine's definition of the word. "I snore," she said. The surprise of it broke something open in his face, and this time he did smile, a real smile, small and uncertain, like a plant breaking through concrete. "I don't sleep," he said. "So that works." 2 weeks later, then a month, then 2 months. The changes were small. They were the kind of changes that only the people inside the house could see. The way Callum's shoulders dropped an inch when he walked into the kitchen in the morning and found Thea there. The way Marta began humming while she worked, something she hadn't done in years. The way Paolo started bringing flowers from the market without being asked, setting them on the counter as if beauty were a thing the house was allowed to have now. And Luca. The changes in Luca were so gradual that they could only be measured in retrospect, the way you can't watch a child grow but can suddenly see that they've outgrown their shoes. His meltdowns didn't stop. They would never stop, not entirely, because his nervous system was wired to experience the world at a volume that most people couldn't imagine. But they became less frequent, shorter. The recovery time between episodes decreased. He began to seek Thea out. Not with words, never with words, but with proximity, moving to whatever room she was in, sitting on the floor near her feet while she cooked or read or talked with Marta. He would rock there, turning his blocks, and sometimes he would push one toward her, and she would pick it up and add it to their line, and the line would grow across the kitchen floor like a road being built between two countries that had never had diplomatic relations. One afternoon, 3 months in, Thea was sitting on the floor of Luca's room, turning a block when she felt something touch her hand. She went completely still. Luca's fingers, small, tentative, barely there, were resting on the back of her hand. Not gripping, not holding, just resting, like a butterfly that had landed and might fly away at any moment. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She let his fingers sit on her hand for as long as he needed, and when he pulled away, 8 seconds later, an eternity, she continued turning her block as if nothing had happened, because she understood that for Luca, the touching was already monumental, and to react would be to make it bigger than he could handle. When she went downstairs, she told Callum. He didn't speak for a full minute. He stood in the kitchen with his back to her, his hands flat on the counter, and she could see his shoulders moving in a way that told her he was crying, silently. The way men cry when they've been strong for too long. And the relief is too sudden. and too enormous to contain. She walked up behind him and placed her hand on his back. He turned and pulled her into his arms, and they stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, not romantically, not passionately, but with a desperate, grateful, human need of two people who have found in each other the thing they thought they would never have. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "Don't thank me. He's easy to love." "He's not easy. That's the whole point." She pulled back and looked at him. "Loving him is. The rest is just logistics." He laughed, a real laugh, short, surprised, rusty from disuse, but real. And the sound of it echoed through the house like a door opening in a room that had been closed for years. Vincent Ferraro did not go quietly. The custody challenge continued through the winter, with depositions and filings and the slow, grinding machinery of a legal system that was being used as a weapon by a man who had money and malice in equal measure. Callum's legal team was formidable. 4 lawyers from a firm that specialized in family law and had no illusions about the stakes. But Vincent had resources of his own, and he was patient in the way that only people motivated by greed can be. The hearing was scheduled for February. In the weeks leading up to it, the tension in the house was palpable. Callum disappeared into calls and meetings that left him tight-jawed and silent. Marta cleaned with a ferocity that bordered on violence, and even Paolo, the most easygoing person in the household, developed a habit of checking the security cameras more often than necessary. Thea did what she had always done. She showed up, she made breakfast, she sat with Luca. She maintained the rhythms of the household with the steady, unshakable consistency that was her greatest gift, the ability to be a fixed point in a world that was threatening to spin out of control. The night before the hearing, Callum found her in the library at midnight. She was reading, or trying to read, the same page for the 3rd time, her mind circling the same fear over and over, that a man in a courtroom could decide that Luca's home wasn't good enough, that his father's love wasn't sufficient, that the world's definition of adequate care didn't include a nonverbal child in a padded room being loved fiercely by a maid and a driver and a man the city called a monster and a woman who had arrived as a debt payment and stayed because she couldn't imagine leaving. "I need you to testify," Callum said. She lowered her book. "I know. Vincent's lawyer will try to discredit you. They'll bring up Nate, the debt, the arrangement. I know. They'll try to make it look transactional, like you're paid to be here. I know." He sat down in the armchair across from her. In the lamplight, his face was all planes and shadows, and she could see the fear he was managing, not for himself, but for Luca, for the boy upstairs who was sleeping, for once, soundly, with a weighted blanket pulled to his chin and a row of blocks lined up beside his pillow. "I can't lose him," Callum said. "I can't." His voice cracked, not dramatically, just a fissure, a hairline fracture in the wall. But Thea heard it the way she heard everything in this house, completely, attentively, with her whole self. "You're not going to lose him," she said. "You don't know that." "No. But I know you, and I know Luca, and I know what I've seen in this house, and I know that anyone who walks in here and looks at that child and doesn't see that he's loved is either blind or lying." Callum leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed. "The other women," he said, "if even one of them had stayed, if I'd been able to show the court a stable household, a partner, a complete family." "You have that now." He looked up. "Do I?" "You have me. You have Marta. You have Paolo. You have Renata, who drives an hour each way 3 times a week because she believes in your son. That's not incomplete. That's more than most families have. The court wants conventional. The court wants safe, and Luca is safe. He's more than safe. He's home." The hearing took place in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and anxiety. Thea wore the nicest clothes she owned, a dark blue dress that Marta had pressed the night before, the one pair of heels she possessed, her hair pulled back neatly. She was aware of how she looked, aware that she didn't match the image of a Mafia boss's partner, aware that Vincent Ferraro's lawyer would see her body and her background and try to use both against her. She didn't care. Or rather, she cared in the way she always had, with a fierce, protective fury that she kept locked behind her calm exterior, the anger of a woman who had spent her entire life being judged by her appearance and had learned to make her actions speak louder than any first impression. The hearing went as Callum had predicted. Vincent's lawyer was smooth and aggressive, painting a picture of an unstable household, a father with criminal associations, a child with unmet needs, a revolving door of failed relationships that demonstrated an inability to provide consistent care. He produced documents showing the parade of brides. He showed photographs of the padded walls, taken out of context, made to look like a cell rather than a sanctuary. He called an expert witness who testified that children with severe autism require institutional support that a private home cannot provide. And then Thea took the stand. Vincent's lawyer, a man named Harrison with expensive glasses and a voice like polished brass, approached her with the slightly condescending smile of someone who had already decided she was not a serious obstacle. "Ms. Calloway, can you describe the nature of your relationship with Mr. McCarthy?" "I live in his home. I help care for his son. And this arrangement began as the result of a gambling debt owed by your brother." "Yes," a murmur in the courtroom. Harrison's smile widened slightly. "So you would characterize your presence in the McCarthy household as transactional?" "I would characterize it as something that started one way and became something else." "Could you elaborate?" Thea took a breath. She looked at the judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked at Callum, who was sitting at the defense table with his lawyers, his face a mask of controlled stillness. She looked at Vincent Ferraro, who was watching her with the same dismissive expression he'd worn on the day of the inspection. "I was a home health aide for 7 years, Thea said. "I've cared for people with dementia, ALS, end-stage cancer. I've been in homes where the families had given up and the patient was alone, and I've been in homes where the love was so thick you could feel it when you walked through the door. I know what neglect looks like. I know what care looks like. And I know the difference." She paused. "When I walked into Callum McCarthy's house, I expected to find something terrible. Everyone told me it was terrible. The rumors, the stories, the fact that 7 women had left. I expected violence or cruelty or something I couldn't stomach. What I found was a father sitting on the floor of his son's room at 3 in the morning, talking to a child who can't talk back because that child needed to hear his voice even if he couldn't respond to it." The courtroom was very quiet. "What I found was a house that had been designed from the ground up around the needs of a 4-year-old boy. Padded walls so he won't hurt himself, a sensory swing, a weighted blanket, a schedule that revolves around his therapy, his diet, his sleep patterns. Not because a court required it, not because an inspector was coming, because his father loves him enough to rebuild his entire life around making his son comfortable in a world that isn't built for him." Harrison shifted. "Ms. Calloway, I'm not finished." The judge raised an eyebrow, but did not intervene. "Those 7 women who left, they didn't leave because the house was dangerous. They didn't leave because Callum McCarthy was violent. They left because they looked at a nonverbal child who rocks and screams and can't make eye contact, and they decided that he was too much. They looked at a life that required patience and sacrifice and showing up every single day for someone who might never say your name, and they decided it wasn't worth it." Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. Everything about her was steady, because steadiness was the thing she had offered this family, and steadiness was the thing she would offer this court. "I stayed, not because of a debt, not because of money. I stayed because on my second day in that house, a little boy pushed a wooden block across the floor toward me, and I understood that he was reaching out the only way he knew how, and that if I left, it would be one more person who told him that his way of reaching out wasn't enough." She looked at Vincent Ferraro. "Luca McCarthy is not a chess piece. He's not an asset to be managed or a problem to be institutionalized. He's a child. He's a child who experiences the world differently than most people, and he deserves to be in a home where that difference is respected, not corrected. He deserves to be with a father who sits with him at 3 in the morning. He deserves to be with people who have learned his language instead of demanding he learn theirs. She turned back to the judge. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a therapist. I'm a woman who showed up and paid attention. And what I saw in that house is not dysfunction. It's devotion. It's the hardest, most thankless, most invisible kind of love there is. The kind that doesn't get applause, that doesn't look good on paper, that doesn't fit into anyone's picture of what a family is supposed to look like. But it's real. And it's enough. The courtroom was silent for 5 full seconds after she stopped speaking. Harrison looked at his notepad. The judge removed her glasses and cleaned them, which Thea later learned was something she did when she was thinking carefully. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with testimony from Luca's therapist, Renata, from Marta, from the pediatric neurologist who had been treating Luca since his diagnosis. But the tone had shifted. Something in Thea's testimony had rearranged the air in the room, had reframed the conversation from a question of adequacy to a question of understanding. And when the judge retired to consider her ruling, the look she gave Callum was not the look of a woman who was about to take a man's child away. The ruling came 3 days later. Full custody remained with Callum. Vincent's motion was denied. The judge's written opinion included a paragraph that Callum read aloud to Thea in the kitchen that evening, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. The court finds that the McCarthy household, while unconventional, provides an environment of consistent, informed, and deeply attentive care tailored to the specific needs of the minor child. The evidence demonstrates not merely adequacy, but exceptionality in the commitment of the primary caregiver and the household members to the child's well-being. Marta, who was standing at the stove pretending not to listen, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and turned up the heat on the sauce. Paolo, who was in the doorway pretending not to be there at all, cleared his throat and went to check on something in the driveway that probably didn't need checking. And upstairs, in his blue room with his spinning tops and his weighted blanket and his row of perfectly aligned blocks, Luca rocked gently, and the rhythm of his rocking was slow and even. The rhythm of a child who is calm, who is safe, who is home. Spring came. The garden woke up, and Thea discovered that it had been neglected, not because no one cared about it, but because no one had the time, and she began spending mornings on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds and planting things she found at the nursery down the hill. Marta criticized her choices and then helped her plant them. Paolo built a raised bed from scrap lumber and said nothing when Thea kissed him on the cheek in thanks. One morning in April, Thea was kneeling in the garden when she felt a presence behind her, and she turned and found Luca standing on the back porch, hovering at the threshold between inside and outside, a boundary he rarely crossed. He was rocking on his heels, his hands pressed flat against his thighs, his eyes fixed on something in the garden. She followed his gaze. He was watching the spinning head of a garden sprinkler, the way the water caught the light and fanned out in a rotating arc. "You can come out," she said softly, not looking at him directly, not making it a demand. He stood there for a long time. Then, in a movement that was both tentative and decisive, the way a person steps off a diving board, he walked off the porch and into the garden and sat down in the dirt beside her. He didn't touch the dirt. He didn't look at her. He watched the sprinkler, and his rocking slowed until he was nearly still, and the sunlight fell on his face, and Thea realized she was looking at a boy who was, in his own way, on his own terms, choosing to be in the world. She went back to her weeding. He sat beside her, and behind the kitchen window, partially hidden by the curtain, Callum watched them, a woman and his son, together in the dirt and the morning light, and pressed his forehead against the glass and let himself feel, without resistance, without armor, without the fortress he had spent years building, the full, devastating, glorious weight of hope. Months passed, then a year, then longer. The story of Callum McCarthy's brides faded from the city's gossip, replaced by other scandals, other mysteries, other lives to speculate about. The house on the hill was still there, still behind its stone wall and iron gate, but something about it had changed. Not visibly, not in any way that a passerby could identify, but in the way a house changes when it becomes a home. Something in the light, or the air, or the almost imperceptible hum of people living together who have chosen each other and keep choosing each other every day. Thea never became thin. She never became glamorous. She never fit the image of a mafia boss's wife. And she did become his wife, quietly, in a small ceremony in the garden with Marta and Paolo and Renata as witnesses and Luca sitting on a blanket nearby, turning a wooden block in his precise, absorbed way. She wore a white dress that Marta had insisted on and that Thea had resisted, and then cried in when she saw herself in the mirror, not because she looked like a bride from a magazine, but because she looked like herself, and for the first time in her life, looking like herself felt like enough. Callum wore a dark suit and no tie, and stood in the garden with dirt on his shoes from the flower bed, and said his vows in a voice that shook, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands were trembling the way they had trembled in the hallway outside Luca's room on the night she had first calmed his son. The trembling of a man whose walls are coming down and who is discovering with terror and wonder that the thing behind the walls is not weakness, but the capacity for a love so large it has been pressing against the stone for years, waiting for someone brave enough to let it out. Luca did not attend the ceremony in any conventional sense. He sat on his blanket and turned his block, and at one point during the vows, he picked up a block and pushed it toward Thea's foot, and she picked it up without interrupting the moment, and held it in her hand beside her bouquet, and Callum saw this and had to stop speaking for a moment, because the image of his wife holding flowers in one hand and his son's block in the other was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen and would ever see in his life. The block stayed on the nightstand beside the photograph of Thea's mother. Two objects that told the whole story: a woman who had taught her daughter to stay, and a boy who had trusted a stranger enough to reach out. Between them, a love that didn't look like the movies, didn't sound like a song, didn't fit into any narrative the world had prepared for it. A love that was quiet and difficult and daily, built not on passion but on presence, not on attraction but on attention, not on the grand gesture but on the small, repeated act of showing up. Years later, when people asked Thea how she ended up married to Callum McCarthy, when the story resurfaced as these stories do, whispered in new neighborhoods, told to new audiences, she would smile and say it started with a bet and a brother with bad habits. And when they pressed for more, for the secret, for the thing that made her different from the 7 who came before, she would think about a wooden block sliding across a foam floor, and a boy who didn't speak, teaching her the most important thing she ever learned: that love is not a language you speak. It is a frequency you match. And some people spend their whole lives talking and never hear it, and some people never say a word and understand it perfectly. She was the only one who truly saw him, both of them, the man behind the fortress and the boy behind the silence. And in seeing them, she let them see her, all of her, the weight and the weariness and the stubbornness and the grace. And what they built together was not a fairy tale. It was better. It was real.